enough about me, enough about this. We need to get started. Uh, thanks everybody for tuning in. We appreciate you joining us for this study on the I Ams of Jesus. Today we'll be in John chapter 10, more a little bit 9 and 10. And we'll be looking at Jesus' statement of I am the door, or I am the gate, as some of your Bible translations say. I have with me a good friend of mine, David Halbrook, Fairbanks, Alaska. David, glad you could join us.
Thanks. Good to be here virtually and in person.
Yes. David and I go back a little ways, actually. I like to say so. David held a meeting at the 18th and Burr Street Church of Christ in Forest Grove, Oregon, back in 2013, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And I was only 3 years a Christian at that point. And then that's where we met and connected. We have a really good mutual friend, Guillermo Alvarez, who's preaching in Ohio right now. David, at that time you were in Arkansas.
Right.
And why don't you tell people like where you've been since then and where you're at now?
Sure. I distinctly remember that meeting. My wife Starla and I thought, wow, we get to go to Oregon. This is great. That'll probably be the only time we ever go to Oregon. Then we moved from Arkansas to Portland, Oregon, worked with the 160th Avenue Church of Christ there. And for our first anniversary, we had some miles someone had gifted to us. And so we decided to go to Alaska. And we thought, wow, this will be the first, probably our only time to ever get to go to Alaska. And then now we are in Fairbanks, Alaska. Been here for a little over a year.
Okay. And I didn't think I was going to be able to find it, but I did. So actually, this is the photo at the time when David came out in 2013.
Yeah.
I can see you're 2 kids fewer in this photo.
That's right.
So, and I think we even had the group photo. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. I do.
So there's David right there. And then, and this is the Saints at the time at Forest Grove. And it was a good meeting. You can stop screen sharing now on that. So, yeah, it was definitely interesting to follow where you've been at. I know I was super excited when you were coming to Oregon at the first time. I had just started preacher training, I think, with Mark Dunnigan at Fifth Street. And and then very quickly, Guillermo decided to move to Ohio, and things didn't work out, and you moved to Alaska, and I moved down to Arizona. So, and David, I understand that the church you're with, the Chino Small Tracks Church of Christ, you guys, even in the midst of this pandemic, you've been able to assemble. How are you guys doing that?
Yeah, one other little background note on moving here. The church has been here since the 60s or 70s, but one reason they decided to move here, they had not had an evangelist for about 30 years, and that really made it a unique opportunity. You know, think about the church there at Country Club Road, how different they would be had they not had an evangelist for 30 years. Doesn't mean that the Christians there could not be equally as faithful.
Right.
Just as we know many churches that have not had elders in that period of time, but God obviously has a role for that work. And so it's a unique opportunity.
Right.
And we're about 30 in number, 25 or 30. And that, back to your original question, that's made it easier for us to assemble like several other churches I've seen. We are meeting in the parking lot. One of the men here, Brandon Cates, is a techie, gadgety guy. And so he arranged to run the microphone outside so that through a very simple FM transmitter, everybody could remain in their vehicles consistent with the government mandates.
Right.
And, everybody brings their own bread and cup, or we have a little bit there available, and we can do everything. We've even put our money in a baggie on the windshield ahead of time so that when it's time to give, there doesn't have to be any face-to-face interaction. Whoever's gathering that can just go vehicle to vehicle and not have to be face-to-face with anyone. So it's really been it's been good as everybody's kind of been locked down.
Right.
Sometimes just through a windshield, still being together and seeing each other. It's been a boost for everybody. Close the door.
Yeah, we have on the screen the two photos that David sent me. Here they are with the communion that they've brought with them. And the next photo shows kind of a closer up of the setup that they're doing. And it's more credit to you, David, because I think, well, how cold would you say it was on that day when that photo was taken?
The coldest, it was probably around 0, but I have to add it that for people here, it's just the way of life. Like,
Right.
It's really like, man, we're going to these extraordinary measures. They always do things when it's that cold. And so
Right.
it's such a contrast to life in the lower 48 that it's like, wow, but really for the average person here, it's like, this is just what you do. Life does not stop at 40 below.
Right. It's kind of like just, the inverse here in Arizona.
Yes, that's right.
We get we're going to have our first triple digit day this Sunday. And, the first one always like, wow, why did I move here? And then you get acclimated to it.
That's
and
right.
You find yourself saying weird things like once the sun goes down, you're like, this feels nice. And it's still 103 outside. And you just adapt. So, anyway, David, we do want to get onto this study. I want just to call attention to that because I think it was a unique way that the Small Tracks Church is assembling, and they're still able to, both respect the laws of man and still fulfill the obligations we have to God. And just because we have these oars doesn't mean there's not creative solutions that the Lord's people can't find to still do both. So,
Right.
All right. So today we're going to be in John chapter 10, or a little bit before that. And before we get in our study, David, you want to lead us in an opening word of prayer?
Sure. Our holy God and Father in heaven, we thank you for the glorious ways you have showed your handiwork in the world that lives, in which we live, that provides for us and all living things. And as the psalmist did, may this then set our mind to be prepared to listen to you, to hear the things that you have said. As Jesus said in this text, we're going to consider that we would hear your voice, that we would know that which is true and right, and look unto Jesus to find those things and to have that confidence and assurance that when we follow him as the door, we have access to life and that we have it abundantly, and we seek that, Father, someday at your feet in heaven. Bless us as we read, that we may understand, and that then we may live and share these things with those around us. Thank you for hearing us and loving us and saving us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right, David, where are we going to start just to provide some background for everybody?
Yeah, this was good for me. I think the context actually goes all the way back to chapter 7 and verse 37, which says that on the last day of the feast, which was the Feast of Tabernacles and Booths, that Jesus was in Jerusalem. This was the fall, the autumn period. And that was about 6 to 7 months before his crucifixion. So there's a series of events that seem to continue without interruption.
Right.
Into chapter 8, when there's the dispute, culminates with Jesus saying, before Abraham was, I am. And then they try to stone him, and he passes through the midst of them. Then into chapter 9, that again, it just seems to be continual. It's the day, and Jesus heals the blind man, and there's all the controversy about that. And at the end of chapter 9, some of the Pharisees come to Jesus saying, and are we blind also? And so Jesus does not give them a yes or a no answer.
Right.
chapter 10 is really his way of answering that question that do you see or do you not see? And so we're going to see there's lots of application.
Mhm.
We can find comfort here, but it's helpful to know the purpose of this statement is Jesus is showing the blind that you are blind.
Mhm.
Few among the Pharisees that were willing to see, he's going to show them what that means. So this is, and it's a passage of comfort, but it's in the context of controversy.
Right, right. And that's how often, especially I think I noticed in the Gospel of John that a lot of the, well, even just in the Gospels, a lot of the more poignant teaching, the teaching that really goes for the gut, if you will, comes after some sort of controversy or some sort of accusation or something of just people with the religious elite just not getting it. And sometimes it's where God has to be a little bit more explicit with us so we can actually hear and understand. I was having a study last night on John 1, and that point was made um, because we were looking through in John 1 how many times either John the Apostle says this or quotes John the Baptist saying that I'm not the Christ, I'm not the light, I'm not him. How many times that had to be repeated in every which different way because that needed to be repeated multiple times just so people could hear and understand it.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's a good point, David. So that, like he said, that brings us to the context of everything of what the backdrop for our study today. And David, do you have a section of scripture you want read first as we go through this?
One other part
Oh,
of
go ahead. Sorry.
in verses 1-6, Jesus begins to try to answer that question by saying that the sheep they follow the voice of the shepherd, and
Right.
the shepherd leads them through the door into the sheepfold. And anybody who tries to come in any other way uh, is a thief and a robber. And then verse 6 ends that they didn't get it. Jesus gave them this illustration, but they
Right.
didn't understand the things which he spoke to them, primarily because from the parable of the sower, they didn't want to. But
Right.
this is going to, now in verses 7-10, he's going to try again. He's going to stick with that illustration and kind of take it to another level.
Right. Right.
So if we just want to read the entirety of the text to get the big picture of what we're going to be studying, and then we can go back through it a little bit.
Yeah. So we'll read verses 1-10 because that's going to be the chunk we're going to be addressing today, and we'll be addressing the next I am statement Jesus makes in this chapter next week when we'll have Brian Haynes on to explain some of that stuff. So the text reads, and I'll be reading for the New American Standard. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. A stranger they simply will not follow, but will flee from him, because they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus spoke to them. They did not understand what those things were which had been saying to them. So Jesus said to them again, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly.
Any other thoughts on verses 1-6?
Nothing really insightful other than just the emphasis of the fact that, this idea of hearing and following or hearing and obeying. This has been coming a lot up in a lot of my studies and just talking with people. when we're talking about belief and faith and how does that relate to salvation and everything else, because biblically we have not heard God rightly if we do not obey him. Um, if we are spurning his word, if we are not obeying, if we're not following it, then God assumes either we've understood it and we've rejected it, or we haven't understood it. And one instance of that is found in Deuteronomy 6. This is not the only instance in the old covenant or Testament law that God ties these two together, but in Deuteronomy 6 and verse 3, this is God's words that he gave Moses say to Israel. He said, "O Israel, you should listen and be careful to do it. It may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in the land flowing with milk and honey." God ties the two together. And so Jesus is doing a similar thing here. If you're truly going to be a sheep of the Father, one of his, you're going to know his voice and you're going to follow the shepherd in his path. The sheep who wanders outside the fold, that's the one the shepherd has to come and bring back in and discipline. And but eventually, if a sheep goes too far out of the way, shepherd counts him as lost. And because he's not following the voice, he's gone after other voices. And so there's a real lesson to both the non-believer and the believer that, for the non-believer, I can't say I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Jesus if I'm not following his voice or following his teaching. And to the Christian, we should take this as a reminder that we need to be constantly listening for Jesus's voice and following it. To do any less is it's to make ourselves vulnerable to have the thief come in and steal us away.
Right.
So.
Right. In verses 7 through 10, I noticed Jesus just weaves. He begins with himself in verse 7. And as we go through, you'll just see he goes from himself to them, back to himself, to them, to himself, and then that'll continue on into the next I am. So verse 7, then Jesus following up on that first parable or illustration, there makes the statement that's really the theme of today's lesson, that I am the door of the sheep. The door obviously is access to the safety, the rest, whatever provisions are there in the sheepfold. And the door is the way that the shepherd directs the sheep in, and the door is the way that the shepherd leads the sheep out for food and drink and whatever they need, whatever their needs are. The door is that means of access to going in and out as directed by the shepherd.
Right. Yeah, that's something, I think you emphasize well, and we just want to reemphasize is, or maybe this is a point that we want to deal with later, but Jesus being the door means Jesus is the only door. There is no other way to God except through him. A lot of people don't like that. We live in a very pluralistic society where, we think all truth is, your truth is not the same as my truth, and we both have our own truth, all that stuff. Well, truth, by its very definition, there can only be one. It's that which corresponds to reality. And if Jesus is saying that he is the way, the truth, and life, which is a later statement, I am statement, and he is saying, I am the door, there is room for nothing else. And so that doesn't mean there's no room for other saviors. There's no room for what I think God should be doing. There's only room for Jesus.
Right.
And
you and I, and probably most people with us today, we're used to hearing that, but then to think about how jarring this would have been for the Jews, the Pharisees, to hear, probably none of them would have made a statement like that. And all the rabbis that they would quote or refer to, I don't think they would have had any rabbi making a claim like this. And so Jesus, again, on the heels of having said, before Abraham was, I am. And then healing on the Sabbath and all the controversy that stirred up. This is just a continuation of what was said about him from the beginning, that he spoke as one
Right.
having authority. And so this statement had to get their attention, not as though his others did not, but just another way of emphasizing that exclusive claim that you emphasize.
Right. We have Robert Miles who writes in, and I think he adds a good point to this, that this door, why it is exclusive, that is, there is only one door. It is a door that is open for all who would walk through it.
Yeah.
He quotes Luke. He says, Luke recorded by inspiration Acts chapter 14, verse 27. When they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
That comes right off on the heels of the conversion of Cornelius, the first non-Jewish convert. And the controversy ensued after that, and the council finally, the inner gathering finally realizing that God has opened faith to the Gentiles, and we have no right to deny their entrance to the gate. So
Right.
So
Going to all the world,
right.
this door.
All right.
Okay, verse 8, then he kind of turns his attention to them and to any others who would claim to lead the sheep, any who would reject the door, as he says, who would try to come in another way. He describes them as thieves and robbers. This could include anyone in the past.
Right.
I think Jesus is especially talking about the present and the Pharisees.
Right.
And
You know what? Two biblical examples of those might have been in Acts chapter 7, I believe. Gamaliel and his testimony before the council refers to two men, Judas of Galilee and Thaddeus. I think it was Thaddeus. Two men who had rose up at prior times and led people away, claiming, I think by inference, to be the Messiah.
yeah,
And his counsel there was, these Christians, if it's just another Thaddeus or Judas, this is going to go away. But if this is the real deal, we can't stop this.
right.
So, yeah, I mean, he's definitely worrying about, to them in the present, about false Christ, which is also an ever present and applicable lesson for us. We have to be on guard for false teachers, false Christs, those who would mix together the pure word of God and traditions of men, or who would try and start substituting some other deity for Jesus or anyone else. So,
Right. And they had claimed back in chapter 9, verses 28 and 29, when they were talking to the no longer blind man, that, well, we are Moses' disciples. But it's evident that they did not focus in their teaching and in their example, they did not focus the
right.
people on Moses' words or upon God primarily. They certainly did to some degree, and maybe even to a large degree. But as you mentioned, alongside that, they had invented a system of exceptions and additions that were on Rabbi so-and-so, human tradition, human authority. And so,
Right.
15, Jesus' disciples were questioned. Why aren't you washing the hands according to the tradition of the elders? Why aren't you participating in this practice that could have some benefit,
Right.
but was the origin of which was not from God, not from Moses. And so just another example of another way that was a current threat at the time that Jesus speaks.
Right. And you bring up a good point, David, that, the Pharisees and Sadducees, we sometimes as 21st century Christians, we get a misunderstanding of what Judaism was supposed to be, what God's law originally was, because we spend more time in the New Testament than we do the Old Testament. We're New Testament Christians. That's understandable why that might be unbalanced. But by doing all that, spend all that time in New Testament, the Judaism we encounter is the Judaism that the Pharisees and Sadducees had warped and made, not the law that God gave through Moses originally. And people following the Mark Roberts daily Bible reading or any Bible reading plan, this is about the time where we're starting to get into the history books. It's that time of the year, and so we finished the law. And one thing that impressed me on this time reading through the law of Moses is actually how non-burdensome it was. How many provisions God made for mercy, of how to make up the sacrifices. Like, okay, if you accidentally sin, like this is what you do. If you're unclean during the Passover, you have this opportunity. Like God understanding, even taking special consideration, like, okay, if you can't afford this sacrifice, here's a substitute.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, in the first century, the scribes and Pharisees, I mean, Jesus had called them out repeatedly. You lay heavy burdens on the people that you yourselves are not willing to bear. They had made the temple of God a mockery and a place of business. Here you have your average Jewish citizen just wanting to do what was right by God and live, and provide for his family. And repeatedly, the religious elite just made that impossible, which only added to the people's longing for Jesus, which was something I talked about in a study last night. Is the religious elite wasn't ready for the Messiah. The people were, and that's why we see so many people just flocking out to him. Even though they had quote false Christs, raised up before, we'd mentioned Judas and Thaddeus. Thaddeus only took away 400 people. Judas of Galilee around the same amount. Jesus is drawing crowds of thousands. So even while some might suspect, well, he's just another pretender, he showed he's more than just, people knew something was different.
Right.
And often in his teaching, he would correct the abuses of the law, and he would show that this is not what God intended. So by fulfilling the law, correcting it, and then laying down his new covenant as well. So anyway, but yeah, back to your point, I rabbit hole there. You're right. They focused more on tradition than they did the actual law of Moses. And it's interesting, my rabbit brain here. They were so enraged at the trial of Jesus, at his quote blasphemy, and they claim to be paragons of keeping the law of Moses, that they violated the law of Moses in the trial.
Right.
False witnesses, the high priest tore his garments, all the stuff. So again, it shows the inconsistencies of them and them focusing more on traditions rather than the word of God, because, we did the same thing today. Tradition is so much easier to follow because tradition can change and tradition can be set aside when it's inconvenient. Meanwhile, the word of God, you can't change it. You can't easily set it aside. And there comes very stark penalties for violating it or neglecting it.
Right. Which just illustrates again a misconception of the Pharisees sometimes. Right. Well, they were legalists. They were too strict with God's law. That's a misconception. They were right. They were liberal. They were loose. They added to, and whether even if they emphasized God's words more, well, they still failed in that they emphasized to an equal degree or even to any degree the traditions of man. And too much is, any amount is too much. And then Jesus points out that the sheep did not hear them. And so we know there are the blind who will follow the blind into the ditch. And yet all throughout this time, whether it was Thaddeus or the other that you mentioned, but even in the time of Jesus, there were still people who they could see that contradiction, and they said, I'm not following that.
Right.
There were still the remnant, to use that Old Testament language, those who asked for the old paths, there were still those people, as you alluded to. Then when Jesus especially came on the scene, then that was the time where I know something has been wrong here, or maybe they've
Mhm.
pinpointed it, and now they're seeing the direction to follow.
Right. I think of a statement that some of them made in Mark's gospel when Jesus started teaching. I believe it's Mark chapter 3. No, Mark chapter 1, in verse 21 and 22. They went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he, that is Jesus, entered the synagogue and began to teach. They were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching as one having authority and not as the scribes. Um, you can almost picture what a sermon would have been like by a scribe or a Pharisee or a Sadducee. It maybe come to a reading of the text and says, well, Rabbi so-and-so, and quotes Rabbi so-and-so, and then, well, this other rabbi, and quotes a lengthy passage from Rabbi so-and-so. And really, all you really learned was what these other guys think about the passage and not actually the passage. Here comes Jesus, speaks to the text, tells you what it means, and makes the application. And, it's interesting that you and I have probably had just as many experiences similar as that. Is, we get visitors every once in a while from the more liberal brethren, or we get visitors from the denominational world. And this is how I know they're of those two groups. Is if they're older, almost universally, an elder and I will get the comment, I have not heard preaching like that in years. And it's not saying this to brag on myself, because I don't think I'm a great preacher. But what's the difference? Is, okay, one is, you've told me what everybody else thinks about it. I don't know what it means. You don't tell me how it applies. And the other is, it's time in the text. What does the text say? How do I apply it? And that's what Jesus was doing.
Right.
And that's authoritative. You're not appealing to any other authority but the text. So
Right. So there are always people looking for that. And
Mhm.
again, Jesus is boiling it down. The sheep did not hear them.
Right.
It's also fair to acknowledge that there are times where people who are sheep, they can be confused,
Right.
distracted by, or there's even this time where, okay, well, is that what God's wants, or is the other what God wants? It isn't always an instantaneous,
Right.
oh, sheep, well, then you don't ever consider anything that could potentially be false.
Right.
This is an excellent example of that. He was among the Sanhedrin, and we most notably notice Nicodemus in John chapter 3, but then he pops up, I think it's in chapter 7, and he's someone that's obviously trying to sort out everything that he's
Right.
seeing from Jesus, and that he's hearing and seeing from people that he respected and that he was among. And
Right.
so it's also worth acknowledging what Jesus is saying is not just, well, if you would believe some error, then you're obviously not a sheep.
Right.
There's a time where we have to sort out what is the voice of God, not speaking inwardly, but what does
Right.
he want? And that process of understanding the will of the Lord, it can be confused or distracted in the process of trying to understand his will.
Yeah, it takes time, especially when you think about, the early church experiences. You had the vast majority of the church were Jewish converts, and so you're brought up in a certain way of life, practicing certain things, and then you're trying to sort through what the law says. And at the time, this new Jesus fella, and it takes time. And for us today, we take somebody who has spent, say, several decades following traditions of men, or in some sort of church that you don't find the Bible, and they encounter what the text says for the first time, and it takes a little bit because it's new, and you're trying to make sure the honest heart is trying to make sure they're doing what God really does command. And it does take time to shift through error from truth.
Right.
But I'm convinced from the text and knowing some of the character of God that God gives us the time we need to shift through that.
Right.
Now, as always, God's estimation of how much time we need may be different than our estimation, but He does give us the time.
Yes.
We eventually get to a point where we need to make a decision.
Right.
But it is interesting on how, to your point, is they're honest seekers out there trying to figure out what does God actually want me to do. So that's a good point, David. Appreciate that.
Sure. All right, move on to 9 and 10. So Jesus says the sheep did not hear them. Now he shifts back to himself. Again, I am the door. And I'll just parallel verse 9 and verse 10 of what he says about himself. So if anyone enters by me, he will be saved.
Mm-hmm.
He will have life. And then he talks about going in and out, finding pasture, would parallel verse 10 of this having life and having it abundantly.
Mm-hmm.
In contrast to the thief, who again he says kills and destroys and steals. So this contrast of one or the other, it's the left or the right, it's black or it's white.
Right.
I am the door, salvation and life and pasture and abundance of blessings are available exclusively through me. Here, Jesus, and he's not involved in a power struggle with them. It's not a tug of war to see who gets to be the door of the sheep. He's not debating that proposition with the Pharisees. He speaks again as one having authority. He who enters by me, he will be saved. And
Right.
any other way, any other category, any other teaching, he says in plain terms, they're thieves, they're robbers, they're stealing, they're killing, they're destroying. And so again, that exclusive claim. And then also this shows, and he'll expand on this later in the paragraph in the text next week, he's also showing subtly, and then it'll become more plain, that he's also not in a power struggle against the Father like they were trying to pit him to be and to characterize him in the minds of the people. Again, that's obvious to us. But that was definitely one of the ways the Pharisees were trying to turn the crowds against him, as though he were in a power struggle against the Father. And just the opposite, of course, is what he's going to show in following verses.
Right. Robert Miles writes in again, and we want to thank him again for writing in. And I think he brings in a verse I think applies to us following the shepherd's voice. From Revelation chapter 3 and verse 8, quote, I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. He has a comment, says the church in Philadelphia, what a great hope we have. And I want to thank Robert for writing in, because he's absolutely right. You know, listen to the shepherd's voice. It doesn't matter that I think one application we take for that, that's on us. And we can hold fast to that word, even in the midst of the most wicked environment, even in the midst of persecution. You study the 7 churches of Asia, the church in Philadelphia stands out as one who was doing a lot of good. And, Jesus says right there, I know your works. I know you have but little power as far as earthly terms go, but you have not denied me. You have held fast my word. And because of that, Jesus has set that open door before them that cannot be shut. So good thoughts there.
Right.
So we were in 9 and 10, and picking up where you were left off. I think you were starting to make a comment before we got to that comment from Bob. So,
I mean, I think I had finished his voice that leads to salvation, and then the abundant life that he he includes in that. Had a couple thoughts on that more in the application phase.
Yeah, I think that now this might be a good time to move into that. It's this the promises that Jesus gives here. We really can't undersell these. I mean, you'll be saved, you will go in and out, and you will find pasture. You'll find that rest, that good grazing ground, using that analogy there. And you'll find rest not only physically but spiritually, because Jesus is watching over as the good shepherd. By contrast, as you said, that black and white contrast, the thief comes to only to steal and to kill and destroy. And I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So, but what Jesus promises, and this is one area that many people think that, if I become a Christian, it's going to be no fun. I'm going to be living a very dull life, and that's the farthest thing from the truth. The dull life is the life in the world. The dull life is, working 5 days a week, get my paycheck on Friday, to blow it all Friday night, Saturday, and to wake up Monday morning, try and do it all over again, week in, week out, with no larger purpose. The dull life is being enslaved to my desires and my urges, and being at their whim and doing whatever they tell me to do, instead of being the master of my own passions through the strength of God, and living a life that has purpose, instead of the life that's just by instinct. And Jesus promises a great, abundant life as a Christian. Doesn't mean health and wealth all the time, but it means it is still far more abundant than whatever the world can provide. Any further comment there before we get on the application section?
That again, kind of leading into that, just
Right.
that this pandemic probably is another good illustration of that. Not only the people who are stuck in the routines of life now, when that routine gets thrown off, where are people going? And as we discussed yesterday, I've read that alcohol and pornography and pot have significantly spiked during this time, where people have this time on their hands, and the purposes that they've designed for their own lives have been ground to a halt.
Right.
And that people can dabble in that and see the consequences of it. People who are swallowed up by that is not an abundant life. It's self-destructive, physically, logically, emotionally, and most important, spiritually, as opposed to when our routine is thrown off, whether because of this, present circumstances, or some other, the things that have been taken away from us or halted are not the most important things.
Right.
And we have access to the same blessings that we did before, sometimes just by some other methods of accessing them.
Yeah, and it's saying that is, some healthcare professionals and mental health professionals have been saying that really the pandemic right now, it's not so much as causing all these issues, it's putting a pressure cooker on the issues that are already there.
Yeah.
And so if we see a spike in that stuff, I want people to know that was going on before. And we're only seeing it now, like the fault lines really come out in stronger numbers because, again, people are cooped up. So especially there's been a lot of attention to loneliness because we are living more isolated lives now than we ever have. And a pandemic has pretty much astronomically heightened that issue. We've known from other health studies that loneliness shortens your lifespan. It's not good for your mental health. Going back all the way to Genesis 1 and 2, the very first thing that God said that wasn't good in creation was that man was living by himself. Again, in the context that originally the partner was for marriage, but the primary purpose was man was living by himself.
Yeah.
And we're communal. We need that. And for the Christian, that's kind of tying into this. Yeah, things have had to change, but I like what Terry Francis had to say there today on Facebook. He made a post about all all the work that elders and preachers have put into overnight having to become tech experts, of still trying to make sure that in some way, shape, or form, brethren can still connect. We can still unify around God's word, and that there's still opportunities to still maintain those social connections, even in some parts of the country where we can't be together. Um, and so, you know, what our community would you have if you're not a Christian that you would have these selfless servants be willing to spend the extra time, money, resources to make sure that one, content, teaching doesn't stop, but also elderships who are anticipating needs right now and are willing, able, and of actively seeking out, okay, who's going to need our help? You know, maybe to brag on some of our elders here, but talking to one, they are anticipating long-term, need eventually down the road when we get out of the pandemic and we deal with the economic aftermath. Like they're fully anticipating, like, okay, economy-wise, it's not going to go back to the same, but we're here to take care of our people. God has placed us as stewards over this particular group of sheep, and we need to shepherd them right. And you're hard pressed to find something like that outside of a Christian context in our current modern world.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, great points, David.
How are we doing on time?
Oh, we're, I think we can get to the last two applications and we'll wrap it up.
Okay. Which one do you want to start with?
Well, or the last, we can just go through all the applications. Sorry, I thought we already went through the first one.
Okay. I think I kind of jumped ahead.
That's fine.
One thing in reviewing this text is to see, as we discuss that exclusive teaching of Jesus, I would ask the people watching, do you see examples in our society of people moving away from the idea of anything being exclusive, objective, right, and truth? And why is that mindset either changing, or why would people focus upon the idea that there is no absolute objective truth, especially in the area of morality and human relationships and decisions? Just curious what people see and what are some examples of that.
Right.
One example of that, I've visited up at the university, an atheist humanist group on campus. They meet every week, so I've gone, and in a conversation I had with one of them about evidences for faith, talked generally about the prophecies of Daniel, and one of the students that I was talking to, he was just kind of questioning whether we could know anything that had been recorded in history, because it all might be some plot. And I said, well, do you have any doubt that there was a man named Nebuchadnezzar who existed? Just trying to show this degree that, look, Daniel's not a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Darth Vader-ish. And his answer was, I doubt everything. He wouldn't even give me a straightforward answer about a historical man named Nebuchadnezzar. And this was a history major. And because of the worldview he's chosen, God can test his heart. I just was giving me an honest answer, but he's not even 100%. He's not even sure that there was really a man named Nebuchadnezzar, that it's within the realm of reasonable possibility that even that man and that name, that could just be I can't think of the phrase, but a
conspiracy,
some motive or agenda that has created this character Nebuchadnezzar.
Right.
And that's the result of some other other beliefs that he has or that he is rejecting.
Yeah, and it is interesting that that whole postmodernism of relative truth and stuff. It eventually came around to the bite the historical field in the early 2000s. There was a book written in defense of history, and it argued that objective facts, not just truth, like facts, can be known. And I remember taking my historiography courses, the 300 level of the study of history. That the last day of class, the professor gets up there and he asks the question he asked at the beginning of class 10 weeks prior. He says, okay, what is history? And this is after a whole semester, a whole quarter of studying the different approaches and stuff. And I remember one student was trying to argue for a relative truth approach to history. And I forget the words of the professor, but he said to the effect of like, okay, if that's what you believe, then you don't need to be in this department or this field. If we can't know anything at all,
Yeah.
then the whole realm of not just history, mathematics, psychology, the whole field of human study and inquiry collapses.
Right.
And so, I have yet to meet somebody who was 100% consistent with their views that truth is relative. Now, I would credit the guy that you talked to. If he's been 100% consistent, like, more power to him. He's one of the few people I've ever met that is that consistent. Really, what ends up happening is, and several have pointed this out, when we reject truth claims, authority, we're not really objecting to the principles of them. We're rejecting a specific presentation of them, and we're exchanging that for our own authority. We don't, I'm sure that person would say, well, I don't think you're, the way I'd say to them, like, your parents never existed. Just made up story that you made up to make it more believable that you're real.
Right.
Well, he lived with them. He's grown up with them. He has concrete proof they exist. And really just comes down, why believe anything at all?
Right.
Yeah, but anyway.
The end result is you only trust yourself, nobody
Right.
else. But then why would you trust yourself?
Right.
So just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we know nothing, and that's part of the
Right.
flaw in that thinking.
But
we just keep our eyes open to this mindset that rejects any truth being exclusive, and then we go back to the fundamentals: one body, one spirit, one hope, one faith, one baptism, one Lord. Those are consistent with the one door.
Right.
The next application, again, just brief, but again, to encourage everybody that's watching to think about the things we've read later, just as we can each look back in our own life and see times where we were trying to do what's right, but there were subjects, topics, questions, passages where we were confused or distracted, or we were comparing competing voices, different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
You can look back in your own life and how did you work through that and finally reach a conclusion and have conviction in trying to reach others with the gospel. Then think about that same process you went through, what helped you, how other people helped you work through that. We've got to preach the word, 2 Timothy 4:2, convince, rebuke, and exhort, then do that with all long suffering and doctrine. And that's what Jesus was doing here in John 10. He doesn't back down from the truth.
Right.
The fact that when they didn't understand it the first time, he didn't yell and scream and walk away. He continued consistently with the doctrine, and he did that with long suffering.
Right. And, I think an example about that, of just, maybe it's further applications, is understanding where people are coming from, what might their processes have to be. We were talking before we went live on this that I had a recent study that, the first half hour of the study, I just sat there and listened to the person walk me through. I thought we were here at this understanding. I think we're not. So how do we get from here to here so I can better help you and, help me help you understand this?
Yeah.
And, that goes back to that long suffering thing of just having the patience, because it's not about winning arguments. It's about winning souls. And what I mean by that is, if we're putting being right all the time above the person's soul, we're gonna tend to be brash, we're gonna rush, and we're gonna not teach the truth effectively. If the goal is to win the soul, that means we're not going to compromise on truth, but we're going to be patient, we're going to be long suffering like Jesus, and we're going to be thinking of, okay, how can I help this person navigate all these conflicting voices?
Right.
And one way I would say we can do that is constantly be pointing back to the text. And for example, individual had told me the way he got converted was there was a man who was studying with him, and he just had him read Mark 16:16. And he just asked him, what did the Lord say you need to do to be saved? And he told me, he says, I repeated the verse back, and then I added but and my argument. And the man that he's staying with, he just goes back. He doesn't argue with the argument. He doesn't address it. He just goes, but what did the Lord say you need to do to be saved? And he did this like 4 or 5 different times. And the man told me, he says, eventually you get tired of arguing against Jesus. And so, one way I can help people navigate is have the text, use the text often, and use it abundantly.
Right. Again, 2 Timothy 4:2, preach the word means
Right.
convince, rebuke, and exhort. Before you rebuke them, well, convince them. And you see Paul going to the synagogue for weeks, reasoning, persuading. And I've thought more and more that that's a very logical progression. First you convince, and then when you feel sure they understand it and they're just resistant, then you rebuke them.
Right.
And then you might have to convince a little more. And then when they get it and they're kind of teetering on, do I do it or not? That's when you need to exhort them. And so that provides a general approach. It's how you would teach our children. First we convince, and then we rebuke, and then we exhort. And that's what others have done with me. And that's what Jesus is doing here.
And there's a lesson from history. David Lipscomb, preacher of the 1800s, he held a unique view on Christian non-involvement in government and stuff. And somebody had asked him, well, the congregation had written to him, is he edited the Gospel Advocate, wanted to know if that should be a line of fellowship. They wanted to withdraw over a man because they didn't hold to the non-participatory view. And Lipscomb said, absolutely not. There has not been enough teaching on this yet. And in his mind, and again, we may disagree about his position, but the principle is he understood that until the brethren have been taught adequately, we cannot make this a line of fellowship because they don't know any better. We need to teach and instruct. And once everybody has sufficient knowledge, then that's when we go to rebuking, as you were saying. And that's the same thing like when we're teaching our children, teaching new converts, other brothers and sisters. Until there's been sufficient teaching, we can't skip ahead to the rebuking and the withdrawing and all that stuff. And just so no one takes my words and runs with them, every person's different. There's no cookie cutter approach.
Right.
Some people take much longer. There's a man I've been studying with. I think he's 50 something. It took him the first 50 so years of his life to come to a belief in God.
Right.
From atheism to belief. And so I'm going to be a little bit more patient with him, because if it took him 50 years to make that big of a jump, it might take him a little bit longer to understand some other things and come to the conclusion that he needs to do what the Bible teaches for certain things. So, each person's different. Understand their background, where they're coming from. That's all part of, teaching, rebuking, exhorting with all long suffering. So.
Right. And last, we touched on this again, but for people who are watching, just to take away, think about what are the basic elements of having life. So we've discussed that some, of salvation, of forgiveness, Jesus and his death and his resurrection, and then the New Testament teachings about what faith, the response of faith, of penance and confession and being baptized.
Mhm.
So think about the basic elements of that abundant life as we touched on. For the sake of time, I won't turn, but 2 Peter 1:3-10 talks about the promises. He's given us all things for life and godliness. And then if we'll spend our lifetime adding, which verses 5-7 is not a strict catalog checklist, but
Right.
it just gives, if we spend our life in those kinds of things, adding those things, and then when I feel like I have all of those things to some degree, then I spend the rest of my life abounding in those things. And I haven't correlated these two passages before, but these things are yours and abound. That's the abundant life that Jesus
Right.
is talking about. And in every season of life, when life is easy and comfortable, we need to hone in and focus our lives and minds on those kinds of things.
Mhm.
Life is hard and it's difficult. Then, and again, if we'll go back to those things of life and godliness, of faith and perseverance and brotherly kindness and love, then we've found the door. And
Right.
and every life, every situation is different, so I can't tell you and here's what it's going to look like.
Right.
But that's the abundant life that Jesus offers to you and to me and to all men throughout the world.
And we would encourage you, if you're not a Christian and you're watching, please reach out to either us here in Tucson, Arizona, at the Country Club Road Church of Christ on our website, and that's in the description below. Or if you're in the Fairbanks area with the Chena Small Tracks Church, we maybe physically can't be near each other right now, but as you can see, we're studying over Zoom. We can stay over the phone, and I will tell you this: that it does not matter what the government order is. If you have need to be saved, if you have need to be baptized for remission of sins, we'll make a way for that to happen. And so, if you want to have that abundant life, please do not hesitate. Uh, you need to study and figure out how do you get into that. Please reach out to one of us. We can point you in the right direction. We're willing to do that. I want to thank David for joining us today. Appreciate the study. It was a great study. I think we've talked a lot about what it means that Jesus is the door. How do I have that abundant life? And we had some great discussion on the applications thereof. So, David, you get the final thought.
I appreciate the invitation. Like I said, we've done this a few times in the Portland area, and
Oh yeah,
Brendan was up here with the church last fall,
yep,
and so got to have a little taste of Alaska there. So
it was
been
great.
thankful to get to do that virtually and really in the lower 48 and up here, and just keep up the work. And my family continues praying for those who are watching, whatever season and phase of life that you're in. You're in our prayers as well. And since especially this, since the church there is hosting this, I mean, just appreciation to the church there for their help in sending and sustaining my family here.
Yes, I forgot to mention that we are partially supporting David, and so there's a unique overlaying of fellowship and friendship that's happening. The church here is providing a small portion of the annual support, and then just that this happens to coincide with the fact David and I are good friends, so both biblically and personally. So that's all good. So appreciate everybody for tuning in. Again, be sure to tune in next week, same time again, 12 o'clock Pacific. We'll be looking at the next I am statement. I am the good shepherd. And then if you are in the greater Tucson area, we live stream our worship service at 10 a.m. and that can be found on our YouTube channel, which you are currently watching. So check out our website for years of Bible teaching materials. And again, if you happen to live in Fairbanks and you would like to attend Assembly of the Lord's Church, bring your car, the Chain of Small Tracks, where they're still attending in person. So, well, thank everybody for tuning in. Guys, have a great week, great Lord's Day, and God bless.